Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Karwaan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. And we are recording this on the 16th of August 2025 as part of the Beyond the Myth workshop. This is a workshop that we have been doing for over 9 weeks. And the main aim of this workshop was to uh, challenge the WhatsApp history narrative and the NCRT narrative now of history, which has been going on doing rounds and influencing opinions on India's past, and look at history of India academically using sources and arguments. So we have moved from prehistory to Indus Valley civilization to the Mauryas and the Guptas, and then to the Mughals, Delhi Sultanate, and then we came to the coming of the company. After that, 1857. But before that, the Coal Rebellion, the Santhal Rebellion, Mapila Rebellion, and so many other resistances that the different parts of India saw. One can't say it was a nation at that time, but different regions of the subcontinent saw. And then comes the revolt of 1857 and after the coming of the Raj, the imperial Raj. And in the first guest lecture, we had the honor of hosting Professor Mridula Mukherjee on contending interpretations of nationalism, Indian nationalism, where we looked at historiography of Indian nationalism from colonial to nationalist to subaltern and Marxist and other interpretations of history. And today we have the honor of hosting another of my mentors and longtime guide since we started Karwan. So it's almost 6 years of association with Professor Aditya Mukherjee through online and offline mediums. And it's a truly an honor because Professor Mukherjee is one of the most important scholars of modern Indian history, having worked with Bipin Chandra for a long time with his two magnum opuses that he wrote, India's Struggle for Independence and India Since Independence. But after that, he wrote three very important books on imperialism, colonialism, and political economy of colonial and post-colonial India. Even the very important book on RSS and school textbooks, which becomes an important read one if one has to look at how history is being rewritten in school textbooks and what is the influence of quote unquote the greatest NGO which completes 100 years this year, according to our Honorable Prime Minister, RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. Today, Professor Mukherjee is going to talk about the historical origins of India's growth strategies and especially the political economy of colonial and post-colonial India. So, without further ado, thank you so much, Professor Mukherjee, for accepting this invitation. It is always a joy to host you on Karwan. So, over to you. I'll see you again after this lecture for the Q&A. And we are joined by about 12 people here on Zoom and those who are on YouTube who will be watching it later, but they are also there in spirit.
Right. Thank you very much, Ishan. Thank you for organizing this workshop and for a change, including contemporary history in it. Because what I'm going to be talking about will bring you right up to the present, and we will see shortly why historians are necessary to look at contemporary issues. It is not to be abandoned to the economists and political scientists and sociologists, right? And what I'll talk about is and I'm also thankful that you are doing something which questions the myths around our own history. And for my subject, the roots of India's development strategy, the biggest myth is that the Nehruvian period was a disaster. I mean, it is. In fact, you forgot to mention my last book, which is Nehru's India. The past, present, and future, where I have a whole section which talks about the demonizing of Nehru and particularly his economic strategy. every problem of today, whether it is poverty or whether whatever, is linked somehow to our slow growth or whatever, is linked to Nehru completely in a false manner. And in the course of my talk, that will become very clear. In fact, the latest book on the subject, Critiquing Nehru, is by a person who was the economic advisor to the current regime, Arvind Panagaraiya. So, it is not just the pamphlet level of propaganda that is spread, the WhatsApp stuff, but they have even produced scholarly books which rubbish the entire Nehruvian experience, which is what started our development strategy to begin with, right? Now, firstly, let's be clear, what is India's development strategy since independence? What is unique about it? The obvious uniqueness of India's development strategy, when you compare it with other post-colonial countries, is that we followed a democratic and a sovereign, independent path of development. Almost the only country in the post-colonial world which did so. Most countries either had dictatorships of one kind, military or bureaucratic or whatever, or authoritarian regimes, or became authoritarian regimes very fast, or were junior partners to one or the other of the superpowers. India did not follow either of this path. Now the question is, why was it so? Why was the Indian development strategy unique? And the answer to that is what takes you back to history. That is, like the economists typically, when they write about post-colonial independent India's economy, start from 1950, the first plan. And there is a mandatory introduction, because in school we are taught you never start an essay without an introduction, in which they say that before independence there was a Bombay Plan and a National Planning Committee, So, it's just as if that's it, nothing else. It all started with 1950. That's not how it happened. It's a truism, but a truism worth repeating, that the nature of a state, of any state, is determined by the nature of the movement that creates the state. The nature of India's development strategy would be determined by the nature of the state, right? Now, what is the nature of the state is determined by the movement that created the state. Let me give you an example. I mean, let's assume that the Soviet Union was a result of the Bolshevik movement, the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, at the end of the Bolshevik Revolution, you could not have created a state which was bourgeois democratic, because the movement was not bourgeois democratic. Or let's say the Pakistan movement was a movement which was based on religion, Islam, right? Now, at the end of it, even though Jinnah made that famous 1946 speech that now we shall be a democracy, minorities, and Mr. Advani quoted it and poor fellow got kicked out. But Jinnah, that speech in the end couldn't make Pakistan into a secular democratic country. You cannot ride a tiger and at the end of it suddenly say, I'm now getting off. The movement has a momentum which determines the nature of the state. So in that context, what is the nature of the Indian national movement which created the state, and what is its impact on the nature of the state? Now, there are 2 or 3 things. You will see that why I'm an economic historian, and why, as I said, a historian needs to look at economic matters, because we see the enormous weight of history in determining our day-to-day economic matters, right? Now, what about our national movement has major implications for the post-colonial Indian state? Firstly, the Indian national movement was a prolonged and a mass movement. It was the movement of over 100 years. And it was a mass movement. What am I contrasting it with? It's not a guerrilla movement. It's not a quick capture of power by a professional revolutionaries or the Red Army. It's a mass movement involving the people, millions of people. In fact, the greatest mass movement in world history, where millions upon millions of ordinary peasants, workers and all other classes, women were involved and involved over a prolonged period of time. The result is that the ideas of the movement therefore go deep down into the minds of the people in such a movement. And the result is that then those ideas cannot be overthrown in a day. What is the contrast I am making? You cannot have a dang on Mao in India. What do I mean by that? As you know, the Maoist strategy, Mao dies, Deng comes to power, and he completely overturns it overnight. He says, his famous statement that I don't care what the color of the cat is so long as it catches mice. So whether it is socialism, capitalism, whether America is our friend, enemy, everything can be turned upside down. So because our objective is China's development. So he could completely overturn the Maoists. You cannot do it in a democratic system or in a society where the ideas of the movement have gone deep down. The Chinese Revolution was not a prolonged mass movement like in the Indian case. All right. Now, what are the ideas of the movement that I am talking about? And you'll see the relevance of what I am saying even today. And I'll point it out to you how. There are multiple ideas, but basically 5 core ideas of the Indian national movement, which Rabindranath Tagore called the idea of India. And these core ideas are that the future India will be sovereign, it will be independent, which means that future India will also fight for other people's independence, right? It will not keep quiet when the Gaza is being massacred and even collaborate with Israel for an imperial project. On the contrary, right from the beginning, India stood up, for Vietnam, it stood up for Korea. Even when we were in the 1950s, when we were very weak, we stood up for the rest of the world. So sovereignty, anti-imperialism in other words, was a key idea that went deep down. The second idea was democracy. India will be a democracy. And mind you, this is an old idea. As early as the 19th century, Tilak in the 1890s is talking about adult franchise. Decades before anywhere in the world, you had adult franchise. In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, you're still debating whether women can have a vote in many parts of the world, most parts of the advanced world. In 1960s, in the United States, where everybody wants to run into go now, that they are still debating whether the black have the civil right to sit next to you, leave alone vote, or travel in the same bus. You're still having the civil rights movement in 1960s. In India, in the 1890s, nearly a century ago, the conception is that the future India will be democratic. And by democratic, they meant the conjoint term that India will be a secular democracy. The term secular democracy were conjointly used in the colonial period. Why? Because you cannot be a democracy unless you are secular. You cannot be a democracy by saying, I believe in democracy, but democracy only for the Hindus or only for the Muslims. The other can go take a walk. No? So it cannot be. Just as communalism and loyalism were conjoint terms. All communal parties, Muslim League, RSS, Hindu Mahasabha, they are all loyalist. So they were conjoined. Similarly, democracy and secularism were conjoined terms. So India will be an inclusive democratic nation. The idea number 2. Idea number 3 was there will be a pro-poor orientation. Not necessarily communist or socialist, though that was a powerful strand in the Indian national movement. But the consensus was on pro-poorness. from Dadabhai Naoroji in the 19th century. His first book is Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. If you read Dadabhai Naoroji, R.C. Dutt, Rana Day, I'm talking of the moderates of the 19th century. Each one of them starts with on the issue of critiquing the British because it causes poverty. So poverty was at the heart of the thing. This idea is taken further, primarily by Gandhiji. Turn your face towards the poor, the Daridra Narayan, the whole idea, and then the socialist and communist left movements took it even further, right? So pro-poorness was the third. The fourth, or the last element, was the future India will be a modern, forward-looking India based on what Jawaharlal Nehru called a scientific temper. It will not be based on obscurantist, traditional, superstitious ideas, right? So these were the ideas which are called the idea of India, core ideas. Now, the point to note is that on these ideas there was a consensus. It is not Jawaharlal Nehru or Gandhiji's idea. Consensus from the moderates, Naroji, Janade, Tilak, extremists, C.R. Das, Sardar Patel, the so-called right wing of the Congress, Gandhiji, Nehru, Subhash Bose, and the revolutionaries, Bhagat Singh, all of them, the entire spectrum of nationalists were agreed on these 5 ideas. You quote me one nationalist who is not agreed to this, communist, socialist included, right? The only people who did not agree to this idea of India were the communalists and the loyalists. All right? Now, but we'll return to this later. So, but since I had mentioned that a contemporary relevance of these ideas going deep down and that you cannot reverse them is the fact that you can see that now you have a government in a majority. Absolute majority in the center, not only in one state or 2 states. They have a majority in the center, absolute majority. They believe in Hindu Rashtra. They shout it out from the rooftops, even from the ramparts of the Red Fort. But you don't still have a Hindu Rashtra. Because the ideas of, the core ideas of the national movement haven't yet been completely overthrown. And that is why the current regime gets so desperate. And that is why you are seeing what has been called a turn towards fascism. Use of force in the education system, in the media, in the other instruments of state power, police, judiciary, etc. Because you have to communalize everybody. And it's not an easy task. You have to overthrow the task that was performed by 100 years by our freedom fighters. Just capturing political power or forming a government doesn't do so. So it's an important idea. Now, what is its importance to the post-colonial state or the economic policy? The state that is born in 1947, therefore, cannot have an economic strategy which says, let us first have an authoritarian regime in partnership with the industrial bourgeoisie and have quick growth. And then we'll talk about democracy, 30, 40 years later, the South Korean model. Nor could you say, let us have an authoritarian regime which can suppress all kinds of other opposition and push growth, the Chinese model, what was then called the totalitarian model. Nor could you say, let us have a strategy of becoming a junior partner of a superpower and have a semi-sovereign country and power economic growth, the Japanese model. Japan grew from 1950 to 1970 at 10% per annum, and that is what catapulted Japan from one of the developing countries to the number 2 country in the world. But that is the time when they were America's, basically the base for the American enterprises in Vietnam, Korea, and the world over, right? Now in India, if anybody argued any of this model, they would be in the dustbin of history. And as a matter of fact, nobody argued it. Nobody. Even the capitalist class did not argue it. If you look at the Bombay plan, which is called the Tata Birla plan, which almost every major industrialist in the country signed, which was written in 1945, one of the key elements they say is that this plan can be implemented only by a sovereign, independent, and democratic country. See, nobody was arguing for this alternate path, and that is the power of history. That is the power of ideas in a national movement, right? So that is the general introduction I wanted to give you to understand what happened after independence. The second thing that we must remember before we, and particularly the economists, and particularly the ones without any historical sense, must understand is that the path that was to be chosen by India, at that time after independence, was a unique path. As Jawaharlal Nehru said, uncharted in history. Or as John Mathai, a very famous economist, a Tata director, who also became finance minister after independence, said that this is a path with no guidance from history. So these people who were actually trying to make history understood that there was no guidance. What do they mean by it? Historically, when the transition to industrialism occurs, to modernity, quote unquote, nowhere has it happened with democracy. Think of transition, the Industrial Revolution in England. What are the working class conditions? Dickensian conditions. Where is the ideas of democracy is, decades away. Let me explain another concept. How do you industrialize? Technically, the process that is required is called primitive accumulation, right? You need to accumulate sufficient capital in order and invest it to industrialize. Now, where do you accumulate that capital from? You can't say, let's tax the corporate sector. There is no corporate sector. So how does industrialization happen? Historically, it happens on the backs of the working class and the peasantry. Forced collectivization. For example, in the Soviet Union, 50% land tax in Japan. Inclusion movement in England. So either it is on the back of your working class or peasantry, or it is on the backs of other people. Every country in the world that industrialized in Europe and in the West had colonies. England, France, Spain, Portugal, just think of it, any country you can, USA. USA, of course, takes one step further. It has slavery. Not only what they appropriate from the colonies, they bring the labor from the colonies also and in their own country, right? So where is the question of democracy? So what India was trying to attempt after independence was, it could not say now that we are independent, let's colonize at least our neighbors, Nepal, Sri Lanka, etc. and grow on that basis, or that we'll take away our working class rights. On the contrary, with independence, before independence, Indian peasants had to part with roughly 50% of their gross produce as rent and revenue and other exactions that went from them. After independence, Indian peasants didn't even have to pay a 50 paisa tax. Over. Nothing. You cannot take anything from the peasantry. In fact, in the Nehruvian period and after, there was a net transfer of income to agriculture through subsidies. Right? So you can't draw capital from the peasantry. Neither can you draw it from the working class by denying them trade union rights, as happened in Korea and many other countries. I'm giving the Korean example because it's an example that is often cited. Panagriyas and others will keep saying, look at Japan, look at Korea. But they don't look at these aspects. So, in Korea, even till now, the working hours are 60 hours a week. Until recently, if you had a trade union movement, it would be crushed. The question would not arise. So, in India, on the other hand, after independence, if you look at the trajectory or the graph of trade union movement, there's a rapid increase. Working class rights increase rapidly. I mean, year after year, there is new legislation giving them more and more rights. Right? So, it was a unique experiment. And the world, if you look at the economists of the 1960s, there was a consensus. Those of you who are familiar with economics would have heard of W. Rostow, Mandelbaum, Kuznets, any of the big economists of that time. There was a consensus that the Indian model of development is the ideal model in a democratic world. They were contrasting it with the totalitarian world. Right? So, now, taking this difficult task forward, and that is what why the Nehruvian effort is so important. Nehru does it in very successfully, and in I will give you the figures in a moment, in a manner that is democratic. And I want to make this point. This is a new point you must, Ishan, note, that the Indian Revolution was not followed by a civil war. The Russian Revolution was, the French Revolution was, the Chinese Revolution was, millions of people had to die. Right? The Indian Revolution was not, because democracy was a non-negotiable idea, and Nehru believed in it, and he would not push his own views, however good and radical they may be, unless he could carry people with him. And therefore, what we had after independence was what is called the Nehruvian consensus. There was a consensus. He was able to get a consensus from the capitalists while being a socialist himself, and persuade the communists who were waging war against him in 1947-48 to come and join the effort. So the development effort was a consensus across the spectrum, and therefore there was no civil war. Nobody was suppressed. Nobody had to be killed. No kulaks had to be murdered. Right? Land reforms with democracy, unheard of in history. In Japan, it happens with General MacArthur's army sitting there. In China and Russia, you know how it happens, with mass annihilation of the class enemy. Nothing of the sort. But you still have land reform. The zamindari system, 200-year-old system, disappears in 7 years' time. By 1957, the backs of the talukdars and zamindars is broken. It's something to be recognized before every pipsqueak gets up and starts critiquing Nehru. Then it was a great effort that was made. And what was the result? When they say there is no growth, slow growth, you look back from today, historically, and say, if only Nehru wasn't there, he would have grown at 8%, 9%. Arey bhai, have a heart. There is a notion of initial conditions. Where do you start from? What was the initial conditions with which Nehru starts? 85% of Indian people illiterate, 94% of women illiterate. The average life expectancy, which means the average age by which Indians died, was less than, you won't believe it, less than 30. People died in their 20s on an average, which meant, imagine how early the poor would have died. From childbirth to probably by the time they were 5. They were dead. That's why you had such large families, because you assumed that half of your kids will die, right? Now that's where he's starting from. A stagnant agriculture, a very small industrial base, and almost total absence of scientific establishments. That is where he's starting from. So that is number one. Then look at what actually he succeeds in doing. I'll just give you some quick figures. Indian agriculture from 1950 to 65, the Nehru period, grows 8 times faster. That is several hundred% more. 8 times faster than it grew in the previous 40 years. 1900 to 1940s figures are there with George Blind's major work. Compare that with the Nehruvian period. It grew at about 3% per annum, a rate of growth which we have not exceeded till today. So agriculture did famously a turnaround, complete turnaround. And it was done in the Nehruvian period through institutional reforms, the land reforms which I just now spoke about, and through technological reforms. The Green Revolution was something that began in the Nehruvian period. It is not Lal Bahadur Shastri, as it is said, who brought in the Green Revolution. The technology that was required for the Green Revolution, you could not have the Green Revolution without tractors, without dams, without irrigation, without electricity, without diesel, etc. All of it was put in place. Nehru was deeply aware that agriculture cannot grow unless you have industry, right? It had to be a combination. And even the strategy of intensive area development, the Green Revolution strategy, was already started in Nehru's time. It is after his death, of course, primarily in Indira Gandhi's time, that the Green Revolution took off. But the process had started, all right? And industry grew at about 7% per annum, which is a very high rate of growth, considering we inherited a period when there was deindustrialization. India, from being the largest industrial country in the world in the 18th century, had shrunk to one of the lowest. So from that to average a 7% rate of growth is very important. But it's not just the rate of growth. What is it that the Nehruvian, what is called the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy does? At independence, Nehru says, India has got political independence, but we do not have economic independence, which is what is called a neo-colonial situation. You get independence politically from a country, but you are dependent on the same countries from whom you got political independence. Like when India became independent from 1945 onwards, there were delegations going out from India all over the world to see where we can buy machinery. Because India made no machinery, none. More than 90% of any machines that you required had to be imported. Even 95% of machine tools like pliers and wrenches had to be imported. Remember the initial condition. That's where you are starting. You want to have independent growth. Growth is possible only if you invest. If you invest, you need machines, but you don't have machines. You have to go back to the same countries, USA and England and Europe, to ask for those machines. And as I said, these industrial delegations went around the world seeing where can we now get machines. So that is the situation. Nehru says this is intolerable. We have to transform this. And that is why the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy of development, in heavy industry-based, capital good industry-based, based on the public sector, because the private sector did not even have the resources to build up quickly the capital good industries, right? So this model was adopted, and look at the results. I'll just give you 3 figures, dramatic, and I'm just amazed how most economists, do not pay attention to it. These are figures that I have not invented. I mean, any economic survey or any statistical survey, you will find the same figures. In 1947, as I said, more than 90% of machinery had to be imported to make any investment. Through the Nehruvian strategy, by 1960, only 43% had to be imported. And by 1974, only 9% had to be imported. In other words, India could maintain its development growth rate up to 91% on its own basis. Only 9% of machinery needed to be imported. This is what is called the unstructuring of colonial structure. That is Nehru's contribution. It is that which gave you enabled you to have an independent foreign policy. It is that which enabled you to caucus-snook both at the United States and at the Soviet Union. It is that which enabled you to have the non-aligned movement where over 100 countries followed the Nehruvian path, saying that we are not going to be junior partners of either of the superpowers. Just translating self-reliance into Atmanirbhar Bharat doesn't make you self-reliant. There is a basic thos work that needs to be done, and that is what the industrial sphere I've just now demonstrated Nehru did. He realized A, you need to industrialize, you build capital goods. B, you need to be self-sufficient in food. Your agriculture has to grow simultaneously. So both these were taken care of. And as I said, the scenario, the industrial scenario in India was completely transformed by the public sector. Just listen to the names. The Hindustan Machine Tools, the first sort of capital good. The first time watches were made in India were HMT. When we were kids, if you had an HMT watch, you said, wow, which HMT made tractors, it made watches, it made all the machine tools that you required. The BHEL, the Bharat Heavy Electricals, the Heavy Engineering Corporation, the Hindustan Antibiotics, the Indian Drugs and Pharmaceuticals Limited, so that you didn't have to import drugs from all over the world, Fertilizer Corporation of India, Bharat Earth Movers, Hindustan Aeronautics, Shipping Corporation of India, all started in Nehru's time. All of them in the public sector. So when people like Tirthankar Roy and who wrote this Oxford Economic History of India, which he said is an abridged version of the Cambridge Economic History of India, which even Lord Curzon would have been embarrassed, because he argues that the best thing that happened to India was colonialism. Had colonialism not happened, India would not have reached where it has. So all power to colonial Britain. So Tirthankar Roy, Meghnad Desai, Arvind Panagriya, they all believe that the Nehruvian period, in fact, Meghnad Desai made the famous statement that the first 40 years of India's independence were wasted. 40 years were wasted. All that I've described to you now were wasted years. But if you look at the first 30-40 years, by all parameters, it was revolutionary. What are the parameters by which you measure a country's growth? Right? GDP. India was growing at 4% per annum in the Nehru period. A rate of growth which is higher than any country in the world in their initial stages of industrialization. Japan, USA, England, France. And these are not my figures. These are OECD publications. This is Angus Madison's figures. So it was doing famously. Only if you compare, not apples and oranges, but comparable. That is, do not compare India in 1950s with England in 1950s. England has a 200-year start, or Japan in the 1950s. Compare with Japan in the 1860s. This is what great economists like A.N. Raj, etc. did, and they said that the Indian performance is amazing, even compared to Japan, right? Okay, so rate of growth the overall growth rate was very good. The agricultural growth rate I've already mentioned, the industrial growth rate I've already mentioned. But the important thing, that Nehru anticipated the knowledge revolution by nearly half a century. If you look at the first plan, the 1950s, you would think that Nehru is only talking about the temples of modern India being the dams and the bridges and the steel plants, etc. All of which was there. But from the 1950s, one of the first things it does is to build up a technological, educational manpower. The IITs, the IIMs, the CSIR, the Council of Scientific Industrial Research, the Atomic Energy Commission. By 1957, believe you me, the first atomic reactor goes critical in India. By 57, we inherit at independence a barren scientific area because that was colonial strategy, and from there, let me name the institutions: the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, the National Physical Laboratory, the National Chemical Laboratory, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, National Institute of Virology, because Nehru didn't believe that gobar and gomutra and gosnan will throw away corona, or shining a torch at corona, or saying corona go, or banging thalis as the current regime says the way to treat corona. He thought virology is important, and that is in that it is in Pune only the biggest the vaccine growing center emerged, where the National Institute of Virology had been. Then the DRDO, etc. All the major scientific institutions till today that you know of were built at that time. But it was not only that. He also initiated the Sahitya Academy, the Sangeet Natak Academy, the National School of Drama, the Lalit Kala Academy, the Indian Statistical Institute, the National Council of Advanced Economic Research, the National Institute of Design were all there by the 1960s. Stupendous. In 15 years to have created all these institutions, stupendous task. And the result is, as I said, it anticipated the knowledge revolution. Because in today's world, it is not your manpower and your agriculture and not even your industry, but it is your scientific base, knowledge base, which is critical. In fact, the advanced world is pushing away their industry into the third world, saying you produce all this polluting stuff. There are more Toyota cars produced outside Japan than in Japan. The critical areas of growth in the USA are California and the Research Triangle, the universities and the science bases, the traditional Pittsburgh and the areas of automobile manufacture, etc., are gone, finished. In England, the places like Manchester, all the factories are closed. They've turned into colleges and universities, right? So Nehru anticipates that. And the result is today, more than half our GDP is produced by the service sector. And what is the service sector based on? But knowledge. The bulk of the remittances that come from outside India, which is what balances your balance of payments, because as you know, we import far more than what we export. So our balance of payments is balanced on the basis of the remittances we get. The bulk of it comes because of the export of knowledge that is happening from India. So the beneficiaries of the Nehruvian strategy have now become the critics. The person on whose shoulders you climbed to reach where you are, now you are kicking. Now that is in Hindi often called namak harami, or just lack of knowledge. It is not despite Nehru, but because of Nehru that you are able to do the economic reforms and the growth. It is not despite Mao, but because of Mao. All post-colonial countries required 30 to 40 years of inward orientation and unstructuring of colonialism before they could open out to the world. It needed the Nasirs, the Sukarnos, the Maos and the Nehrus. But the illiterates of today would say that if only they were not there, we would have got somewhere else. That is not how it happens. You are there because you could climb on the shoulders of the infrastructure that was created. Imagining opening up India in the 1950s, the Panagriya style, liberalization, or Tirthankar Roy, etc. We would have been a banana republic. So, okay. Now the question is, I'll bring fast forward to more contemporary period. The question is, if all was so good about the Nehruvian period, as I have now described, agriculture, industry, knowledge, scientific, etc., why was there a need for reform? Why was there a shift from the Nehruvian consensus to a consensus on economic reform? Do remember that the economic reform was brought in by a minority government of Narasimha Rao. You know, there is a consensus by then. Unlike China, we could not, as I said, do a Deng on Mao. Suddenly in 1978, you decide that we'll change our path. It took a while. In a democracy, it takes a while. There's a lot of opposition to economic reform and opening up, particularly from the left. But over time, by the 1990s, there is a consensus. The United Front government, which had the communists as partners, was asking for a 10-time increase in FDIs, foreign direct investment. You know, they were not saying stop economic reform. Buddhadev Bhattacharya got, attacked by the CPM itself because he was bringing in economic reform and participating in the globalization process faster than his own party could handle, right? So there was a consensus, right? Now, why did this consensus shift? There are two reasons. Firstly, the heavily state-based or bureaucracy-based, which was necessary in the Nehruvian period, economic development led to what is called the license quota Raj. It means basically, what does license quota mean? Means A, you have either such high import duties to protect your own industries that foreign goods can't come in, or you have a quota. You say that not more than 200 cars will be allowed to come in. And what does license mean? License means the government will decide who can produce what. That is, if 500 people want to produce cars in India, the government will say this is not our priority. The planning commission will say that this is not priority, our economy cannot handle 500 producers of cars. So we'll give a license to only two, as it happened, Hindustan Motors and Premier, Walchand Hirachand Group. Right? Now what license quota does is it kills competition. And therefore over time produces inefficiency. Unless the state is able to punish inefficiency, which India was not able to do. And there were other political factors that came in over time, which led to the public sector also, which was extremely profitable and doing very well, being taken over with chairmen being, people who could not be accommodated in the ministry, etc., given the chairmanship of a public sector organization, etc. So political intervention over time, mostly after Nehru, destroyed a large part of the public sector. So there was a feeling that efficiency levels are going down, so we need to open up to the world. Now, why will opening up increase efficiency? Because if you, let's say, take cars or motorcycles. India was producing cars and motorcycles which are kept in museums in other parts of the world. A Royal Enfield of 1940s. See my machine, and it makes a bur sound. It is like the Second World War machine. Now we did improve on that. The Hindustan Motors, the Ambassador, all that kept changing was the shape of the light. Sometimes round, sometimes square, sometimes big, sometimes small. But nothing changed, right? It was a Second World War thing. So it becomes inefficient over time. As I said, it belongs to the museum. But if you open up to the world, if you allow foreign cars to come in, you have to improve. So the moment the opening up came in, all of them improved. The first people to oppose it was Rahul Bajaj, who had this monopoly on the Vespas and the scooters. He said that it's not a level playing field, this, that, and the other. But once the opening up came, They had to become competitive, and they became one of the world's largest manufacturers of motorcycles. Beating Honda and everybody else out of the frame. So it was necessary, therefore, to open up at that stage when you were ready to open up. All right. Plus, something changed in the nature of world capitalism itself. Internal factors were pushing you towards reform to increase efficiency. External factors were pulling you towards reform because the possibility of participating in the world market increased, which was not there earlier. In Nehru's time, there was what is called, quote unquote, export pessimism. You cannot export goods, manufactured goods, to any part of the world because there is no market for it. They will not buy your goods, right? So therefore, we had an import substituting industrialization strategy, not an export-led growth strategy. Export-led growth strategy could only be done by countries which were junior partners to the big importers like America. Japan and South Korea could do it because American market was specifically open to them, not to others, not to India. All right. So that possibility was not there. But in the 1970s and 80s, there was a massive increase in world trade, about 10 times increase. And in that increase in world trade, the participation of the third world increased, virtually doubled. The second thing that happened was the nature of foreign capital changed. Foreign capital in the colonial times was something which was the entry point of imperialism. Because foreign capital, when it went to a country, had no multiplier effect on that country. To explain to you, those who are not familiar with history or economics, take the example of the railways. When they say the British give you the railways. Now, let's say the British invested £1 million in Indian railways. That entire £1 million investment actually stimulated British industry because we did not make locomotives, we did not make rails, we did not make wagons, we made nothing. So it's their product which is being sold. That is, the backward linkage is all to England, and the forward linkage, what is the railway achieving? It is taking your primary produce, your raw cotton and your food, to the ports for export to England and bringing their goods deep into your territory, textiles. So it is a net loss. This kind of foreign capital is of no use. But post-Second World War, independent Indian states were able to use foreign capital differently, and the nature of foreign capital changed, where, as Eric Hobsbawm in his monumental work, The Age of Extremes, the Short 20th Century, has shown, he's one of the greatest historians the world has produced. He has shown that the nature of world capitalism has now changed. The nature of foreign capital has now changed. It is now exporting the multiplier. Like India can now say that if Suzuki is to invest in India, then it must buy Indian produce, sell in the Indian domestic market, use Indian technology, and by such and such date, make it entirely Indian. Which is roughly what happened with all these Tata trucks that you see. They were all Mercedes-Benz. It was a Tata-Benz collaboration with the clear this thing by the state that by 25 years it must be entirely Tata. So this is what happened with Premier automobiles. This is what happened with Vespa. This is, all of this is the same. So you could change the nature of the foreign capital. Now has changed, and foreign capital was now available. So all these issues changed, and the whole world was attracting foreign capital. China, West Bengal, that is communist West Bengal, were equally fighting with each other to attract foreign capital. As I said, the situation had changed, internal and external situation, and the East Asian miracle was the best example of that. That third world countries could now quickly grow using the globalization process, and that is why India also went into this. Going into economic reform and globalization did not mean giving up the Nehruvian vision. It's wrong to say the strategy changed. Just as Manmohan Singh in 1950s would have followed the Nehruvian strategy, which he did, he worked the Nehruvian strategy for the most of his life. Similarly, in the 1990s, for Jawaharlal Nehru, if he was there, to follow his 50s strategy would be idiotic. The world has changed. India's capacity to participate in the world and what the world the pressures of the world had changed. It was possible for you to open up, right? So, though there were many critics of reform, and those who supported reform, and I did, would argue that economic reforms could, in the new situation, lead to the same objectives that Nehru had of what? Self-reliance and equity. India's self-reliance actually increased with the economic reforms. Our dependence on foreign debt, our debt GDP ratio, our debt servicing ratio dramatically improved. So our self-reliance improved after the 1990s rapidly. And as the poverty except for the first 2 years, 1991 and 92, showed a secular decline till about 2010. So on both these equity and self-reliance, the economic reforms turned to be good. In our book that he mentioned, India Since Independence, we have statistically shown how that is true. Now, the way to look at the economic reforms, the best explanation of that I heard was from this, you must have all heard of Cardoso. Cardoso was the Brazilian president. Cardoso was also a professor, and like Manmohan Singh, whereas Manmohan Singh was considered a liberal right-wing professor, Cardoso was a left-wing person. He led what is called the left dependency school in Latin America, right? So he was a Marxist, and he brought Brazil from military dictatorship into a democratic society and into globalization. And he visited India when the Indian economic reforms had just started in the 1990s, and he met a group of intellectuals, and we were fortunate to be part of that. And in that discussion, there were a lot of people from the left. As it happens, when you hunt around for intellectuals, you end up finding a lot of them from the left, because the right produces propagandists, not intellectuals by and large. So a lot of them were from the left, and they said, Professor Cardoso, how could you do this? How could you as a Marxist lead Brazil into globalization? So he said, you're asking the wrong question. I learned so much from that talk of his. He says, you're asking the wrong question. Don't ask me, why did you globalize? Globalization, he said, is a fact now in the world. The days of the Iron Curtain and the Bamboo Curtain are over. The Soviet Union has collapsed, China has opened up, there is no Iron Curtain, Bamboo Curtain left. If you do not globalize, you will become a Myanmar. The issue, he said, question you should ask is, how do I globalize? Not whether do I globalize or not. You globalize, you have to. How do I globalize? And there the two questions you have to ask is, do I globalize with my sovereignty intact? Or do I globalize by disappearing into the armpit of the United States? The second question you have to ask is, do I globalize with a safety net for the poor? Or do I globalize or do structural reforms by abandoning the poor? And then he said, India, pointing at us, he said, you have an advantage over Brazil on this, on ensuring that your globalization will not give away your sovereignty and abandon your poor. So again, and many people say, what advantage? We are pretty colonial in our thinking, no? We can only see evil in our past and our capacities. So he said, your advantage is that you have a long tradition of resistance and democracy. And he started with Gandhiji. He said, your advantage is that you have the heritage of Gandhi and Nehru and the left and a democracy. Your people will not permit your government to do a globalization which sells the country or which abandons the poor. Prophetic words. Almost from the year 1991, the economic reform started. Every civil society organization in the country started saying, what about the poor? What about the poor? Are we selling out to the Washington Consensus? Are we selling out to Britain, etc., to USA, etc.? These questions began to be raised. Rights-based movements spread all over the country. I remember big part of many of them, particularly the right to employment. And the result was, it is in this period, in the Manmohan Singh period, which brought in the globalization and the reforms, that all your right-based legislations occurred. Right to information, right to food, right to education, right to employment, Manrega, all of them came in this period. Your poor could not be abandoned. And neither could you sell out. All right? What has happened now? This great advantage that Cardozo pointed at, we have started giving up that advantage. We are no longer considered a democracy by the world. The global indexes that study democracy, they now say that India is an electoral autocracy. They don't even use the word democracy anymore for India. Because democracy is not all about winning elections by hanky-panky or whoever, or even fairly. Hitler also won elections. Trump has also won elections. Isn't it? So does that mean democracy? Democracy is also has an institutional, the whole range of things. Democracy is civil rights, right to press, freedom, right to association, hold meetings, right to protest. And if you protest, not to be called Andolan Jeevi and Parjeevi, as our Prime Minister does. He calls protesters parasites. Whereas Cardozo is saying that your tradition is protest, struggle, resistance. That is what we learned from Gandhiji. Protest against evil, protest against wrong, whether it is on the basis of caste or class or gender or whatever, environment. All protest movements in India have used Gandhi for that reason. And all suppressive movements have used Hitler, like the RSS. So the result is, as our democracy declines, is the phrase they use is the downsliding of Indian democracy. So the resistance to not being giving in to foreign powers declines, and the resistance for the people's rights declines, because you're not allowed to. All trade union rights, virtually every trade union right, hard won over the decades after independence, have been withdrawn. If you people are in universities, you would know, all your teachers are contractual teachers, contract workers, informalization of labor, teachers teaching at 15,000, 20,000 a month in most parts of country, and in Delhi, they're very lucky to get 40,000 if they get a job at all. Right? So informalization of labor, the poor are abandoned. The whole world watched with horror that during COVID, our people did not even have the resources to do the last rites of their near and dear ones who died. They just threw them in the river. The world also watched our poor, because suddenly Saab, or the big man, decided that lockdown must be done in 4 hours' time. and lakhs of workers, had to walk at 45 degrees temperature with their old, their young, their ill, dragging them on the roads, walk all the way to Bihar, UP, wherever they lived from the national capital. All you have to do is Google that period and you'll find all of those pictures. Complete abandonment of the poor. While we call ourselves Vishwaguru, celebrate the number of billionaires we have. This billionaire, that billionaire, this billionaire has now bought, that coal mine in that country, etc. I don't have to name them. They're also well known. They're A plus. And while we're bragging about all this, our inequality has reached, the only word I can use is obscene levels. More than half our children are malnourished. In the hunger index in the world, believe you me, we are 111 out of 125 countries. We are right at the bottom in the hunger index, this great Vishwaguru, with lots of billionaires. We are below sub-Saharan countries in the hunger index. We feel very superior, isn't it? We are below almost all the other South Asian countries. We are 111, Sri Lanka is 60, Nepal is 69, Bangladesh is 81. And your Home Minister and Prime Minister keeps talking about Bangladeshis infiltrating your country. Why the hell would they? Your people are hungrier than them. So, to sum up, the great experiment, which was a result of the freedom struggle, the ideas that emerged from the freedom struggle, which was carried forward with great elan by Jawaharlal Nehru onwards, that experiment, that development strategy is at a big threat today. This is not what I call, what India is witnessing today is certainly not what was India's development strategy. It has no independence, it has no pro-poor element in it. There is neither equity nor self-reliance in it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mukherjee, for that very important lecture and throwing light on contemporary India, because when we think of history, we often, as you also rightly pointed, we limit it to 1947, as if history ceased to exist after 47. And we have to look at today's context with the background of the past and how the first Prime Minister, Pandit Nehru, kind of imagined a nation. And he was not the only one deciding it. There was a team of, as you said, Mahana Lobes and other advisors, and John Mathai, who becomes the finance minister in the first cabinet before 1950. And then I don't know if he continued after the first elections, but he was there in the interim government. And then, of course, the 5-year plan policy. And the biggest question you have already answered is on Professor Tirthankar Roy and Meghnad Desai's critique of the Nehruvian age. How do you see, because there was this brief time of Morarji Desai also in between the Congress governments, how do you see that early phase of the Janata Party and their first initial steps of looking at economic policies under Desai and then later on after emergency?
You see, there was no basic shift. There was a lot of talk, but there was in economic policy and in autonomy and in foreign policy, there was no basic shift. In fact, in foreign policy till as late as Atal Bihari Vajpayee, there was no shift in foreign policy. The foreign policy shift is what you are witnessing now, where not a single country in the world is with us on the Pakistan issue. Not one country supported us, where every other country around us in South Asia is hostile to us. Nehru built Afro-Asian solidarity. As I said, 100 countries. Even now, if you go to many of the third world countries, people will still talk to you about Gandhi, Nehru, and Indira Gandhi. Because they identified with that. So that is gone. So the Janata regime was far too short. It did not. The only thing that economists say about that period is that they did a lot of fiscal profligacy. That is, trying to buy votes by giving concessions, write off this, write off that, which has now become very common, free electricity, free water, all debt maaf, especially rich people got debt maaf. This current regime gives up lakhs of crores of rupees to the corporate sector and says these bad debts are forgiven. And if a farmer who commits suicide because he cannot pay back 5,000 rupees, or 10,000 rupees, this is unimaginable in the earlier period. And the Janata regime, as I said, was far too short, and certainly they did not make this kind of a shift in any way. And as far as the United Front government consisted of Nehruvian people, left of Nehru, not right, by and large.
At that time, the capitalist class was also quite different. Jamnalal Bajaj or the Tatas were quite different from today's capitalist class.
On that, there is a complete contrast. The capitalist class at that time were organic intellectuals. John Maynard Keynes used to correspond with G.D. Birla, discussing matters of currency and finance. Purushottam Das Thakur Das had V.K.R. Virao, the Vice Chancellor who became the Vice Chancellor of Delhi University and an education minister, as his research assistant. Purushottam Das Thakur Das appointed the professors of Delhi School of Economics, right? So they were extremely smart intellectuals who argued India's position in the United Nations, in the entire Bretton Woods conference, which created the new institutions after the Second World War, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, etc. It is our capitalists who were sent by the government of India to go fight for our national interest. From that, we have arrived at a situation till 2002. The Indian capitalists still had a broad vision. What is good for India? During the national movement, they did not support the communal and the loyalist forces. They supported the national movement. Even the socialists among them. Even in Quit India, they went to jail. Several of them, Vadilal, for example, the Vadilal ice cream, many people know him by that. The Gujarat industrialist was in jail for several years. Jamnalal Bajaj, you mentioned. Ramakrishna Bajaj, his son or nephew, was also in jail. So many others. In 2002, when the Gujarat massacre occurred, the biggest organization of industry, the CII, stood up and said, this is not tolerable. This is not good for business. This is not good for our image abroad. This should not happen. Right? But then the pressure started. The pressure in Gujarat was put on the CII and over by the national government. And over time, they began to succumb to pressure. But to be honest, some of them, as late as 2014 and 2019, like Rahul Bajaj, like this Shaw, I'm forgetting her name, the famous woman entrepreneur who runs a biotech industry.
Kiran, I think.
That's right. They stood up and they said that there is an atmosphere of fear among business and it is not good. And even Narayana Murthy made public statements saying that this atmosphere of fear is not good for business. But then pressure was put on them. And now you know that how easy it has become for the government, legal or illegal. There will be tax rates, there will be this, that and the other. And the capitalist class not only went silent, but a large section of it has now become cronies. That is, they fund the fascist agenda of the government, knowing what is happening. So the Adani Ambani model has now become a model that the class as a whole is trying to follow. So the capitalist class has become a complete turnaround, and which is the great pity.
Do you see a complete loss of the Nehruvian consensus now, or do you think we can still go back and we are not yet at the point of no return?
There is no other solution in a democratic vision but a consensus. We have to win back the capitalists, we have to win back the working class, we have to win back large sections of society into a consensual, progressive. We have to create again, go back to what had become the common sense. The common sense of the people, if it is becoming fascist and if it is becoming communal, it has to be changed and brought back to becoming more humane, more progressive, more inclusive, celebrating diversity. I mean, we all grew up by celebrating diversity. Even our film industry was celebrating diversity. 50s, 60s, 70s, and all the big hit films that you can think of, Omar Akbar, Antony, and whatever, are celebrating diversity. But now the state is promoting films which polarize, which create hatred. Make up stories about Kashmir, make up stories about Kerala, telling lies. So this propaganda machinery has to be fought. You are doing a great job, and I think there should be hundreds of people like you who need to do their little thing. And that is why I'm willing to spend hours talking to only 12 people, because we have to do our might. The Indian intelligentsia is what built modern India. The Indian national movement was built by the intelligentsia, right? They gave up, they sacrificed, they created the vision of India. And that intelligentsia today appears to have lost its backbone. It needs to grow it again, and there is no other way. Unless the youth and the intelligentsia take up basic human values and fight for them, there is no hope for the future.
Thank you so much, Professor Mukherjee. We have some audience questions, so I'll just turn off the recording for the YouTube people. For those who are watching us on YouTube, as in much later than today, you can be part of such conversations on Zoom by becoming a member or by signing up for the workshops. These workshops help us sustain Karwaan and do these free lectures online using Zoom, which is becoming very expensive by the day. But I think I should also be accused of doing this. But my MA thesis was called Propaganda in Nehruvian Cinema, where I first distinguished between good and bad propaganda in cinema. There is, I give a very small example of the polio drop ad, which was a government propaganda to eradicate polio, which worked. But then bad propaganda like Kashmir File or the Bengal Files. I recently saw this ad today of Bengal File film. So Nehru's contribution moves beyond economics and goes to popular culture as well. And one has to study that his great contributions, and one can safely say he remains one of the best prime ministers because of the notion of initial conditions. He becomes the best. He was the only one who could take us from those hard conditions to a more stable condition in the 70s and in the 80s. Though there were difficulties and unemployment was a big thing in the 70s, we were facing drought and a lot of other famine and other problems during the Indira regime. But we didn't collapse at that time. That I think is one of the greatest contribution. You can read Professor Mukherjee's book on Nehru, which is a very accessible book published this year, I think, by Penguin, and I think it is very important for all of us. It is a very easy to read, comprehensible book on Nehru, which not just talks about his economic policy but also his historical vision, how we should understand his idea of India uh, in greater details. I will publish the link with the caption of the video. So those who want to buy it from big corporates like Amazon, they can do it. Otherwise, please visit a bookshop near you and grab a copy. And if you ever find Professor Mukherjee in Delhi somewhere, try to get the book autographed. I'll stop the recording here and then we'll open the floor for the audience questions.
It's also in Hindi, by the way.
Now it is in Hindi as well. So I think the book can now reach out to a wider audience, which is, I think, very important.
Say something before you stop the recording. You know, one of the things that you mentioned that after Nehru also there were challenges, unemployment, droughts, number of droughts actually, famine-like conditions. And there we must learn from what Amartya Sen has been highlighting. The fact that Nehru kept India as a democracy with a free press. In contrast to China, there were not a single famine death. One death in Kala Handi and 500 newspapers and 1,000 TV channels will show it. In China, it did not exist. Therefore, between 20 to 60 million people died. And the world didn't even know, till very late. So Nehru's contribution for the poor is not only economic, it's political.
Yeah.
Maintenance of democracy is critical for the poor. We tend to forget this. Thank you.
Very true. Thank you so much for pointing that out, Professor Mukherjee. And as I said in the last lecture also, both Professor Mridula and Professor Aditya Mukherjee are the epitome of public historians that we need today to counter the falsification or mythification of history. It's not even history anymore. It's complete myth that we are served every day on social media and in books now. Earlier, we thought books were the source of knowledge and, whatever happens on social media remains on social media. But now when economic advisors of certain governments are publishing history books, or former army commanders are writing books on Indus Valley civilization, one has to think about this discipline and the nature of history. But we remain thankful and grateful to Professor Mukherjee for his continued public engagement, which, as I earlier mentioned, is a continuation of a legacy established by people like Professor Habib, Professor Thapar, Professor Bipin Chandra, who used to host these public conversations at JNU at different parts. So I'll stop the recording here and then I'll ask Tanpreet to unmute and maybe if he can turn on his video to ask his question.